Welcome to the last and probably the next seminar of the Current Challenges series on the cost of publishing. So before we get started, I'm going to very briefly introduce the chair and the panelists of this seminar. I'm going to start with the chair, who's Professor Angela Russell. Angela is a professor of medicinal chemistry in the Department of Chemistry and Pharmacology at the University of Oxford. Her work lies at the interface of chemistry, biology and medicine and aims to discover new small molecules and mechanisms to manipulate cell fate and translate them into therapeutic agents, particularly for degenerative diseases and cancer. Angela has realized several successful multidisciplinary research collaborations and received numerous prizes for her work. Next, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Nick Campbell. Nick Campbell is the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Springer Nature. Prior to his current role, Nick was most recently Executive Editor and Executive Vice President of Global Institutional Partnerships at Nature Research. Nick's first degree, PhD, and postdoc research were in genetics. He also has a graduate certificate in journalism from the University of Queensland. Our second panelist, Stephen Birangi, is a writer and editor of The Guardian, a science of opinion, and the long read. Stephen has written extensively about subjects such as science publishing, and science writing. Stephen is now based in London, but is initially from Canada and studied genetics and systems biology at the University of Toronto. He is also a visiting lecturer at ESCP Business School. And our last panelist is Dominika Gruska. Dominika joined Oxford Physics in March 2022 as a Royal Society and Wellcome Trust Sir Henry Dale Fellow. Her research focused on the physical mechanisms of biological processes. Her early work focused on the biological dissection of bacterial biofilms, which she investigated during her PhD at the University of York and her early postdoc work at the University of Cambridge. The research group aims to understand how epigenetic information is maintained in time. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to our chair. We hope you enjoy the seminar.
Nice to see lots of people here, despite how glorious the weather is outside. So thank you for actually turning up. I'd like to start by getting a gauge in the audience of how much people know about publishing. So perhaps you could raise your hand if you've published a paper. Okay. And I'll keep your hands up if you actually wrote and had an intimate involvement in the submission process of that paper. Okay. So probably about a quarter to a third of the audience.
Pretty good.
Okay, that's good to know. So we're going to cover a few bases here in the course of the discussion this afternoon, but it's just helpful to understand what people's experiences before we start. So I'm going to start really by getting the panel members to talk. I think that's the most important thing before we get on to the meatier topics that we've got this afternoon. So perhaps if I can start with you, Nick. So I guess the work of a publisher is largely behind the scenes. And people in the audience who have been experiencing publishing, we don't necessarily get to see what's going on. So I wonder if you could please just take us through the process, what your job involves and how that process works.
Sure, maybe I can talk a little bit about the scale of this process from our perspective. Now, so Springer Nature does plenty of things, but I guess one of the biggest and one of the most relevant to this group is the journals we publish, right? So I'll focus mainly on that. And if we think about those journals, we publish around 3,000 journals globally. We're not the biggest, but we are the second biggest in terms of publishing companies. And in those journals, in terms of research manuscripts, we're publishing more than 400,000 papers per year, but we actually handle about 1.5 million research submissions a year. So if you're thinking about a pipeline and how we're dealing with it, it's a really big, significant operation. Now, to handle all that, there's more than 10,000 full-time employees that work at Springer Nature, and they include jobs like professional editors. So the Nature journals are run by professional editors, which are full-time editorial, a PhD level and higher editorial staff. You have publishers who are managing the publishing health of academic-led journals. You've got editorial assistants, you've got production staff, you've got marketing staff, you've got, really importantly, huge technology departments now, front-end, back-end developers that are responsible for the platforms that handle manuscripts coming through, and then the platforms that end up publishing on. You've got research integrity teams focused on the integrity of what we're doing, and then of course you've got the sort of standard functions. You've got HR, you've got legal, you've got customer service for dealing with, supporting authors and so on. So it's a whole bunch of different things, but maybe so that's from that big picture selection. I don't want to go too long, Angie, but I just want to take out from an experience from my past to give you, to maybe personalise it a little bit. So one of the first jobs I had at Nature was being a commissioning editor on Nature Reviews Genetics, and so my typical job there was, starting from the beginning, was firstly to think about ideas. What are the key topics in my field that where a really high impact timely review is going to help the literature move forward? Who are the best people in the world to write this review? How do sometimes I would assemble a team to write the review, so I'd take one person who might have never met another person and ask them to write the review for me. Then I'd be taking that review through a developmental editing process, so that means before it even goes out to peer review, that review would be delivered to me in a version 1 state, then I'd go through it in huge detail, looking at the content of the review, give them feedback on structure and so on, and then they'd go back for a first revision stage with those authors, but this is pre-peer review. Then I get it back when it was in a bit more shape, then I'd send it out to peer review. Then we get the peer review comments back on that review article. I'd manage that process. I'd make the decision about which were the most important comments to focus on, which ones maybe they could ignore or so on. I'd referee between those. And I know you're editor-in-chief as well, so you know what this process is like. And then there was, I'd be writing stuff for the front half of our journal. I'd be working with art editors. I'd be working with copy editors as that went through production and so on. So that's just a little flavour of the sorts of things. That's one role, right? And then there's all those roles, all those 10,000 people. They each have different roles in that process. So I've probably gone on long enough. Thanks.
That's great. It's very helpful. Thank you. So perhaps, Dominica, I can say to you. So thinking about the other side now. So you have. And there's not a conflict of interest, of course, you have published in the Nature Springer Group. Very nice paper.
Thank you for your service.
And very good experience.
Well, that's it, exactly. A prelude to. Perhaps you could describe then your experience, perhaps what makes you choose a journal and
yes,
the process would be great.
Okay, so I think publishing for a scientist, a research scientist, can be a bittersweet experience, and I certainly have experiences where it was very sweet and very bitter sometimes, and most importantly, sometimes the time involved to publish is very, very long, and that is something that when I first started in science and research, I totally underestimated. And you have to be quite savvy when you think about career in research, how you plan your time to publish. And I think that is one thing that I have certainly learned over the years, to plan better. In terms of the pipeline of publishing and how that looks like from the perspective of the scientist, so first of all, you obviously need your data, you need your message, and I think the message is really important because that will determine the audience and ultimately the journal that you submit your work to. And I think when I first started, I really underestimated the message. I thought, I have the data, I'm ready to publish. You need a message. And I personally like to test, I like to test my message, and I would call that sort of informal peer review process, where you go, you present at meetings, and you test your message and your data against your colleagues, your audience, and then when you think, well, I'm there, you can go and try to publish. So in terms of journal selection, I go by 4 criteria. First of all, the target audience, so who you dedicate this message to that you want to communicate, and I think that's paramount. And then the impact, and by that I don't mean, strictly speaking, the impact factor of the journal, but the impact of the message. So where do you think valued and will be received well by your target audience. And then I also pay attention to the editorial process as well, and primarily whether my work will be open access. And now I think we're largely mandated for our work to be published open access, so this kind of goes almost without saying that that's part of it. And at this stage, I don't worry at all about any finance, for example, so that I need to worry about later. And so then once you have your message, your target journal, then obviously you write your manuscript. I tend to stick to the guidelines, so the style that the journal requires. I know not everyone does that, but I am a good girl and I like to be following the rules. And then once I'm ready, I submit. And first, I always submit to bioarchive, so preprint services, and then I go and submit to the journal I want. And this is really where the frustration kicks in. Because first of all, during the submission process, inevitably you have problems with the submission portals, and they have improved massively, even over my sort of 15 years experience or so in publishing. But that can be frustrated, and that occurs, and that's when the whole process starts. Now, once your paper is submitted, then you await the editorial decision whether or not your paper will be sent out for peer review. If it is, wonderful, you can relax for about 2 months or so. If not, then it's back to square one. And there's lots of going back to square one in this pipeline subsequently. So then, of course, once you have your revisions, the editors make the decision whether the paper can be instantly accepted, which I believe is quite rare, and you can correct me on that, or is rejected immediately, or you are somewhere in the middle, and that usually requires additional work, and that is a timely process that can take from days to months, if not years, on some occasions, depending how determined you are to publish in this particular journal. And then you do your revisions, you resubmit until you get your final acceptance. And then you can hopefully publish, but only after you follow lots of journal-guided editing processes, which again can be quite frustrating and take a little while. And that is essentially how the process looks like.
That's great, thank you. Can I ask a very quick follow-up question? So I completely resonate with the view. I was told very early in my career, one paper, one message. And I think that it sounds very simple, but actually it's a complicated, convoluted way in which you have to explain what's going on. Your paper's probably not going to make sense.
Yeah, and also one of the things that, for instance, in my sort of type of work is relevant is sometimes I develop new methodologies, and I have a paper which has both the new method but also a discovery in it. And sometimes you need to balance out what will be more impactful, and that comes back to that question.
Where's the novelty? Yeah.
Exactly. So you really need to think about it, because the more you think before you start the process, the shorter the lag time in your publishing. Often, not always, but
that's true. But I would come back to one point that you made, which is there is often a tension between where you ideally would like to publish something and the timescale that you really need to allow. And it's not just about a PI, I mean, as a PI, I'm conscious of this, but also for the younger people in my group, it makes a difference to them particularly. So how do you balance that tension?
So I can give you examples from the past where, for instance, I knew that my message, let's say, will go well in a particular journal, and that was quite quick, and the publication worked well. A great example is actually one from my second postdoc from the Craig, where I thought the message was great. Everyone told me it's really good. So we tried all the top tier journals. We tried 5 different journals, nothing. Reject. Lots of re-editing. And then I hit a sort of lower tier journal. It went out for review, it came back, there was complication with COVID, and I took a decision, okay, that's it. I'm not making any changes. I'm submitting it somewhere else where it could be accepted immediately. And in a very sort of quick process. So sometimes I think if you need to publish for whatever reason, because you want to move in your career, it's sometimes better to go to a safe home when the likelihood that you will publish is high, than really try to aim perhaps a little bit too high, which might require additional work, experiments, etc. So it's really depending on the circumstances, and also what support in the lab there is, because sometimes if there are some other people who can help, then that can obviously speed up the process.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn to you, Stephen. So you're here and you're sitting and talking about this. What's your interest in this topic particularly?
So can everybody hear me okay? I prefer to yell a bit. So I wrote a popular history of scientific publishing for The Guardian that was read by a lot of people and a lot of scientists. I think it was a surprise hit for us because it's a bit of an esoteric topic. And I got the idea for it because I used to be a scientist, did a PhD at Imperial in microbiology and immunology, and at that time published some papers and was quite aware of the conversation within science, either scientists griping about cost of publication, the difficulty of publication, the way in which you needed papers in prestigious journals to, advance or to be the currency of your career. And so I thought that's something quite interesting that most people outside of science don't know very much about. But secondarily, I think that I always think about ways in which I could make scientists and regular people who think about science consider the ways that science is shaped by things outside of the actual sort of work of hypotheses and experiments and data and things like that. And so if you think of the way that science is communicated, this is value neutral for me. I'm not on either side, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but scientists turn their work into narratives and then write those narratives in a sort of letter, which is then published in a journal. And I remember I used to have a PI, a very brilliant man, a supervisor, a very brilliant man, and he thought about science as a narrative to the point that the only way he could brainstorm was to draft papers. We didn't have the ideas yet, we didn't have the data yet, but he would read a bunch of papers, then he would start to draft his own. And so that's just like a way in which, even if you don't, or even if a scientist doesn't do it that intensely, you can sort of see that the way in which you do work in any field, in any way, the process of the work shapes the work in some way. And so I wanted to take a look at sort of, how publishing as the main way that scientists communicate and the main way they advance their careers sort of affects the way that science is done, both on an individual and a large scale. And so, to that end, I wrote this sort of history of how scientific publishing as a for-profit business came to be. And I guess I've kept up with that over time. We'll probably get into a couple of things that I've learned. But I think the main takeaway from looking at sort of the history of scientific publishing is that, it's often said sort of publishing transforms science in a certain way by adding the profit motive, by forcing scientists to think about blockbuster narratives as ways to sort of shape their data. But I don't think publishing transformed science. Rather, publishing grew with science in the 20th century. Like the for-profit publishing system, the journal publishing system grew with science as it exploded in the second half of the 20th century. And it sort of brought it down certain channels that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. And I just think that sort of whether you're the kind of person who thinks that for-profit publishing is awful, a bunch of crooks, and needs to be, totally reformed tomorrow, or if you're somebody who thinks there are some tweaks that could be made, or if you're somebody who thinks the status quo is fine, I just think it's useful to know that history because, if you don't, what's the Keynes quote? People who think that that none of this stuff affects them are in fact being affected by it. So it's just good to know the history, good to know how all this stuff works, so that you can consider, logically on your own terms, how it might affect your work.
Thank you very much. And that's a lovely segue into the second part of what we should be talking about this afternoon, which is going to be on that business model. And so perhaps, Nick, we start with you, and you could tell us a bit about the model at Springer Nature.
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll talk more broadly, and by the way, I'm ready for Stephen to correct me if I get any of this wrong, about the history of business models. So I think, if you go back when the first journal was launched and which was a Royal Society journal, and moving forward from there, the first business models that supported that were subscription models, right? Essentially, they were about, and you can understand how that developed, because it was where was the value coming from this? It was accruing to the people who read it, so therefore it seems to make sense to charge the people who read it that you're getting this information transferred to you, and you pay for it to then support that process. And so that is the subscription model was the model that went on for a long time. And when I talk about the subscription model, I'm also talking about a print model as well, right? Because think about how long the internet's been around and how long, how that's in my career that it's changed from going to libraries and photocopying papers, taking the photocopies back and reading them to a world in which we are now, where everything's digital, right? So the business models they're actually going through their second major change just since I've been around, really, because in publishing, certainly since I've been around in science, because we've moved from being print to digital, and that model happened. That really big changes happened in the 90s and towards the end of the 90s, and now from starting at the back end of the 90s, but now really accelerating, we're moving away from the subscription model as a model altogether. I would highlight, of course, that subscription model is still happening and will still happen for a long time, because there's lots of, like for example in books, we're the biggest academic book publisher in the world. 1 in 3 academic books that are published by us, and there's still a whole bunch of that's supported by subscription model, and that's not going to suddenly go away. And there's stuff like journalism and opinion content that that we do in our world as well, that it is not going to be open access content, because it's not written by scientists reporting on a grant they've at a project they've done. It's about people, skilled people like Stephen and others, commissioning, editing, and so on, that thing. So there's still going to be subscriptions around, but for what you guys care about, which is research, the big change that's happening now is we're shifting to a model in which all research papers are ultimately going to be freely available to everybody, to not only just read, to also build on, modify, adapt, because we're moving to models which are CC BY, Creative Commons licenses, whereby a paper written by someone on this panel, that can be taken and adapted and text used in any way anybody else wants to, based on the CC BY license. So it's a completely different way of doing it, and it's a better way of doing it, right? Let me be really clear about that. It's a better way for science and a better way for society, ultimately, because it's going to make science more efficient. It's going to make it more equitable, and it's going to make a more efficient process to transfer the value we get out of scientific research into impact on broader society. So it's a vital transition that we all have to go through. And then let me bring it back to Springer Nature now, because that's the question you kind of asked me, and I've sort of gone off on a little bit of a tangent. But so we're on that journey at our company, and that includes the nature journals as well, right? We have to transition to where we're no longer publishing any research paper behind a paywall anymore, and we're aiming to do that. So we're on track to hit 50% of the research we publish by next year will be open access, and we want to get to 100% as soon as possible after that.
Okay, that's really helpful. So can I just ask a quick follow-up question to that, so I don't need a microphone? So I can see the equitable nature of this, so that this is now all over the world, irrespective of whether your institution can afford to pay a subscription. Now suddenly people are able to see this. But that comes at a cost, because of course the cost is then needs to be raised, or the price needs to be raised in a different way. So is this at the expense, and we're going to talk about open access in a minute, but of restricting then who can publish?
Yeah, so you've highlighted the key issue, which is this transition will definitely provide a huge equity benefit for readers, right? And we can already see that in, for example, the usage of our content by people in the global south, right? People in Africa, people in, researchers in Africa, researchers in South America, and so on, are already getting the benefits of there being, of this open access content. But the worry is around, okay, the model that has, and we're going to get to this later, but the model that is actually scaled and allowed open access to grow so rapidly is based on author-mediated payments, right? So that is where the author, the person who's submitting the thing, is the one who, proximately at least, is paying, right? Paying an article process charge or an APC. And so that means that the author needs to have the money to do it, right? And so, you know, theoretically, the author does have the money because most funders say, oh, you can use our grant funding to pay for APCs. But if you're managing, if it's just like an allowable expense type approach, so you can use that money for something else, right? So if you're spending it on publishing open access, maybe you're not spending it on consumables or maybe a graduate student stipend or something, right? So that sets up a tension. And then we have fields like humanities and social sciences where grants are not big, right? And so therefore, again, there's an equity issue here. So that's the key issue. But I think there are models that can get us to a point where that is not an issue either, right? And that is where we end up in a world in which we have fee-free publishing for authors, right? And that's where we need to get to. And I think centralised agreements, centralised transitions, and then ultimately publishing agreements that leverage the money that's already been spent on publishing is the scalable way of getting to that point.
That's very helpful, and we will revisit many of these points, I'm sure, later on, with all the panel members contributing. But if I could turn to you, Dominica, so I think it would be helpful to put this into perspective. So how much do you spend on publishing as a research scientist, and how does that actually compare, which is a point that you began to raise, Nick, with the total expenditure in your lab?
Right, so actually, I have to say that so far it was the funders who covered all the costs of any publishing that I have ever done. So, for instance, over a decade ago, when I published my PhD paper, I applied for essentially cost recovery from my funder to publish open access. And now we have slightly different models. So in Oxford, we have block grants by the funders that we can apply to recover the costs associated with publishing open access. Now, occasionally, these grants run out, and then you cannot use your grant to cover those costs. So you have to come up with what I call funny money from somewhere that you can cover those costs. And I know people who paid for publishing from their own money when situations like these occur, because we just cannot use our consumables money, for example, to cover these costs. Now, in terms of how much the APC, I think the APCs now, for open access APCs at least, I only publish open access, are probably in the range of thousands of pounds these days, depending on the journal. So to give you an idea how much that correlates to, let's say, consumables, I would request 20k per person per year for consumables. So a Nature publishing APC, which is I think 9,000-10,000 pounds these days.
For Nature itself, yeah.
Yes, so that would essentially mean half a year worth of consumables. And I have to say that it's a lot. And when you're a starting PI like myself, I would rather send my students to a conference for that money and submit on my work. But I would also like to publish this high impact. So there is a little bit of dilemma. Now, it's all kind of sorted through also the agreements, so like read and publish agreements that the universities or other institutions cover, which are great and work really well, as long as your institution has the substantial funds to cover those agreements.
Absolutely, covering many important issues. Stephen, if I could then come back to you. So, of course, you work for The Guardian, which has a sort of paid sort of subscription model for individuals to read the paper. So, can you envisage something like that working? Would that be a viable solution for academic publishing?
I don't think so, because it's not a viable business model for newspapers, and nor is it a viable business model for most traditional subscription-based services. So The Guardian is not actually a subscription model. Like most newspapers that do well, it is a contributor model. We are free to read, and then you can contribute if you love us. And that's worked pretty well. although it's a bit fraught. Yeah, no, I don't think subscription model, I mean, I shouldn't be much of a tribune. I would think that the subscription model shouldn't have much of, I don't think it should have much of a future. I think the goal obviously should be, and we'll get into more of the nitty gritty of this in later questions, and Nick, you've already sort of jumped into a bit of it, but the goal is it should be free for the end user, and then the details just need to be worked out. I think it is not realistic to expect people to pay for, like regular people, to pay for scientific papers. Now, the charge that you see right now, did anybody log in without their institutional login sometimes? And they see, you can have this paper for $35.99. Now, that's a bullshit amount, obviously. Those amounts were created by Elsevier in the 90s to dissuade people from having several single subscriptions and to make it much more attractive to buy giant bundles so you get all of your subscriptions together. But even if you got that cost down to something reasonable, what's the price of a newspaper? £3 Even if you got it to that, I don't think it's realistic to expect regular people to pay that. People don't sort of see them as like part of their budget. But I think regular people are often surprised during times like the pandemic how useful it can be for them to try to read the scientific literature. So I think we should just, as a sort of ideal goal, we should endeavor to have scientific literature available to regular people. Even if they don't use it, I think it's just good to have, and I think people feel better. We talk about ways in which sort of ideas of conspiracy, post-truth, whatever you want to say. One thing, it's not a be-all, end-all, but one thing that would be really helpful is if everybody, no matter who they are, can just go read the paper. Do they understand it? No, but we're not hiding in an ivory tower to have it up there. And I just wanted to sort of bring the sort of, who can access it thing one step further. And Nick already mentioned this, but I really do just want to note that there is this sort of like hidden factor here, right? Like we talk about regular people accessing the scientific literature. We talk about scientists we always talk about scientists as if they're paying for it, but at least they have full access to it. But as Nick noted, and I would really like to sort of double down on, scientists in the global south, scientists in smaller, poorer countries do not have access to the scientific literature. They just do not, and it is an enormous blind spot. It doesn't get talked about enough. I was doing a lot of reporting during COVID. I talked to government scientists in Kenya who could not get access to research about COVID as it was being published. They were using Sci-Hub. They were asking their friends in Europe to send them papers, and that's just unacceptable. I think we think in an ideal sense that science is sort of, the bounty of humanity, and everybody should be able to access it. So just whenever we're having these conversations, we should remember who can access it, what they're paying for it, and that's why I think the goal ultimately is however we work it out, however we work at the back end, free at the point of use for all people to access it.
There's some really important points there. Thank you. We'll come back to your ideas about how this can be done. Okay, so I want to just slightly digress and talk about predatory publishing in the next section of this. So I'm sure you're all aware that predatory publishing is where you have journals who are actively seeking content, aggressively seeking content, and the idea is to increase fees for ABC charges, and it's often at the expense of the quality of the article. So I can start with you, back to you straight away, Stephen. What's your opinion generally, I guess, on the number of papers that are published, how that's changed, and the proliferation of journals as well, perhaps?
There are too many papers, and there are too many journals. And I think that, put your hand up if anybody would like to sort of say there's not. Not to put you on the spot, but I mean, yeah.
Well, yeah, I might.
Yeah.
I might say it's debatable.
Yeah.
That there are too many papers. I probably wouldn't disagree on the journals point, but
yeah. Okay, well then we'll move to that when you get the microphone. Just to say, for the most part, again, just to go back to this idea of putting science into a narrative. If you look back before, I don't even know where I'd sort of time point this. So before the Second World War, if you look at sort of the turn of the century, you look at BMJ, Science, Nature, most scientific reports are very short and they are not narrativized. Interestingly, they use much more colloquial language, much less technical language. Some scientists have quite a literary flair, but they do not narrativize their papers, something I'm going to keep going on about. The big-time narrativization of papers, the idea of putting your science into an arc that has a beginning, middle, and end, and then we did this, we thought about it, which is mostly, as you guys know from publishing papers, some of it's natural, some of it is backfilling a sense of narrative onto the data you have. I think it's a powerful way to communicate science, but much of it comes out of Ben Lewin and Cell Press in the 1970s, who sort of invented the idea that instead of a lot of small papers, you have these big blockbuster papers. And so I think some science works really well with that, but I think what you have now is a proliferation of reports that sometimes don't work best as a scientific paper. Not all science, not all data, not all conclusions work best as a scientific paper. As a quick example, I'm going to throw my girlfriend under the bus here. She is a researcher at a very high-powered lab at UCL doing cancer research. They are working on a really big paper, which I think is under review at Cell right now. But what they have done is a method. It is a database of cancer. I'm not going to reveal too much, or you'll figure out what it is. But what they really have is something that I think could probably be communicated as something other than a paper. But they have to communicate it as a paper because she's a PhD, she's the lead author, she needs that to go on her CV, the lab needs that to go on their list of papers. But for that, it's a database and a method they've used to collect it. And it seems that that could probably be accomplished by having a database to put that data in and having a repository of methods that people could search. It would be easier to find, probably be easier to use outside of the paper system. So there's tons of examples like that. I think there's a lot of papers that don't need to be papers. So when I say there's far, far, far too many papers, I just mean that we could probably narrow down what exactly needs to be published, but that would of course require decoupling prestige and the attendant career benefits from publishing. I said lots of things should be papers. I think it's a very powerful way to communicate science, but probably not everything needs to be. And I think once you start figuring out what doesn't need to be, the problem may take care of itself. You may be like, oh, we've cut the number of papers in half because methods are no longer need to be paper, databases no longer need to be paper, et cetera, et cetera. As far as the predatory journals go, I don't really do much on that, so don't have a real answer there.
But there's still really important points that you've raised in here. And so one of the things that's interesting about, do we need to publish papers as papers? We've been an advocate for alternative platforms for dissemination, which of course, many subjects do of course do that. Physics, for instance, has different ways, and it may be that those things being rolled out to different scientific communities would be a great benefit.
Yeah, and of course, huge numbers of papers are simply giant data sets, and there's some sort of inferences that they've made, but not even tested, and those things end up in these wonderful searchable databases. You wonder if there was a way to credit scientists and they could go to their tenure committee or whatever and say, I've done this wonderful work, look how many scientists are using it, rather than being like, I had to publish it in JCB, JBC, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, Dominica.
Right.
So do you feel a pressure to publish?
Yes. Yes, I think we all feel pressure to publish, and publish maybe not so much in the quantity as quality. And that ratio of quality is really important because that essentially sustains your academic career. And unfortunately, there is only one currency, I think, in academic career, and that is your publication record. And we may pretend it's not entirely like that, but I think if you want to do research and that's your aim, then you really need to publish well. And so consequently there is a lot of pressure to publish. Now my role is to just do the best science I can do and then worry about the publishing later. So if the science is good, it will find a home and it will be published. So I try not to think too much about the publishing per se as a process and as a sort of my goal in itself. It's the science that is the center, and then publication will come. And I agree with the previous comment about the fact that we don't necessarily need to only disseminate our discoveries in the form of publications. And I think there is now recognition is growing for those alternative formats, and I hope that our funders will also recognize this. And I think the landscape is changing. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of hope in the horizon, but pressure to publish remains, I would say.
That's right. It will take a long time, I'm sure, to break this.
Yeah. And I think scientists are partially to blame as well. I think we as a community, we like to see, good publication record, that means this person is excellent. And I don't think this is the only indicator.
Okay, just add one really quick thing there. If I could double down on the scientists are to blame, I think a lot of the narratives about it are like, for-profit instilled all this stuff, I mean, for-profit companies lock in a lot to do with publishing, but again, the sort of idea of the blockbuster paper arises with Cell Press, and Ben Lewin was first a scientist, and it was a for-profit publisher, but it wasn't part of Elsevier, it wasn't part of Pergamon. It really came from scientists, and scientists loved it. They loved the idea of the blockbuster paper, and so and at the time, people were worried, and they said, "Oh, like you're locking in the need. You're basically giving journals the king-making status to approve, your career moves." But they love blockbuster papers and they love blockbuster journals. And so, yeah, I mean, scientists aren't blameless, and you should always be aware of what's happening around you and where it's going to go.
Can I just add to that as well? Sorry, it's just that when you are, I think lots of scientists like easy metrics to score your success, because we cannot all read all the outputs that we produce. We need to be able to look at something which is condensed into a digestible format and say, yeah, that person is really good, and that's great science. And I think that's what I meant when I said that there is only one currency really, because I think at the moment and that's why scientific community is guilty, that we like those simplifications, and we don't have the time to sort of invest to really assess people's quality based on their full merit, I think.
It's also really hard to do, right? You can understand papers in your own field, but even getting just slightly out of your field, I mean, it's really hard to do, right? And I would highlight the tendency you may just want to have something simple, metric that you can measure, that seems objective at least, is attractive, and not just science. People love it, right? People love a list, right? The top, Guardian. I've seen top 50 lists in the Guardian, and the Times Higher ranking. I mean, people love these sorts of things, right? It's a human thing to do that. But I find myself in violent agreement with my co-panelists about the problems with the publish or perish type atmosphere, and that was going when I was back in my research career. That was still there, but I actually feel more positive now than I ever have about that we could move away from this properly, and that's because I do see substantive moves away from just focusing on publications to diversifying the types of research objects, research products that are rewarded and given value. There's a major movement out there, a coalition on advancing research assessment, which is really focused on that has signatories from many of the major funding organisations. Just this week, we had the new REF, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. They came out with their new criteria. One of the major things that they've changed with it, they're now putting a good deal of their money focused on a criteria of research culture at institutions, right? And that's amazing, because that means that if you put a large amount of money behind something, and institutions like the University of Oxford want to get hold of that money, they will put effort into what is incentivised in that money. So I actually feel more positive now than I have in a long time, ever, for my entire career, that we could get to a point where your girlfriend with her fantastic database and so on. And by the way, I would just say that I think you're right on. We need to have whether you call it a paper or whatever it is, we need to diversify how we distribute the outputs of research and make them out there. However, in defence of research communication, the communication of research is part of research, right? If like me, when I did my PhD, I did some good work, and some of it was not published, right? No one, and the data was certainly didn't get off my hard drive or the disks that I generated. Now, what good was that research to anybody? It was zero use to anybody, right? Because I didn't put it out there. So whether it's through a database that's going to be perpetually available, or a paper that's going to be perpetually available, or a protocol or a methodology or whatever, if it's not available to others to build on, it has not been done. It has been a waste, right? And so that is really important to remember.
Can I just ask a follow-up for that? So, I mean, I think we're all in agreement, even the chair's in agreement, that this diversification is a really important thing in the future. What do you think, if I ask you, what do you think the journal's role is as this sort of transformation goes forward? This diversification of how we should communicate? I
think we've got to support it and hasten it. I think it's hard to. So Stephen pointed out that publishers often are followers from, we're trying to serve the researcher, and if you want a sustainable business model, you can't do that by moving away from things that researchers want, right? So researchers want to get published. They want to get published fast. They want to, and I'm not saying that we're doing a perfect job of it. We're definitely not. But if you start to move away too fast from the needs of the researchers, then you won't move. But I think we can help. We need to, for example, I'll give one example from what we've done. We now require data availability statements on all of our journals, right? So this is a step forward, right? One of the key problems that the whole dissemination of research findings has faced in the past is this the data is not visible. Publications have been overly credited, and therefore the data that actually is the most fundamental contribution that a researcher makes, it's the data that they generate. That is, sometimes until recently appeared as data available on request, right? And we know that data available on request usually means data never available whenever you can request it, right? And so if that data is not available and can't be used, that's again useless. So we now at least have got these data availability statements have to be made. So you have to say if it's not been deposited in an appropriate repository, right, that's accessible to everybody via a DOI. Why not? What are your reasons? You have to state it. So it's at least shedding light on that, and I think we can move further along that thing, and we have to support that in all the aspects of open science. I think need to be supported by that still very important step of publishing a paper.
That's right. Thank you very much. So we could move on again with revisiting open access journals. I guess we've touched on this already. Nick, so we're supposed to be back at you. So I guess, you've explained a little bit about this, but if you go a little bit further about the thinking your publishers about the importance of this move to open access, what this means and what this is really going to mean about sustainability and how you see it evolving. Well,
for me, it's vital. I remember more than a decade ago, I was managing editor of Nature at that stage, and I really wanted us to start publishing open access even back then, and it wasn't, didn't get the momentum back then that we now have. But personally, I think it's vital. I agree completely with Stephen. We need to make the products of research available to the scientific community wherever they are in the world, and we need them to be able to build on that. And there's also the impact side of this. I'm not talking about impact factors or citation, whatever. I'm talking about impact on society and the broader implications of that. We have to make this change. It's absolutely vital that we do that. Can we do it? Yes, we can do it. And moreover, we can do it without really significantly increasing the cost. I believe there's enough money. So at the moment, if you look at the whole global system, the amount of money that gets spent on publishing, so that's both open access publishing and subscription publishing, it's less than 1% of the research funds spent overall, right? That doesn't need to go up. That doesn't need to go up to transition us to open access. We just need to take the money where it is at the moment and transition it from supporting a subscription model to ultimately supporting an open access way of publishing, right? And so, and that can be achieved. We are achieving it, right? We are achieving it already. We can see it. Let me give you an example. In Europe, right, we're seeing these transformative agreements coming up that are now happening in the UK as well. So, you know, there's a transformative agreement with the UK sector negotiated by JISC with Springer Nature and most of the other publishers, which means there's fee-free publishing for the vast majority of researchers in the UK now. Germany had done that slightly earlier. Germany, that entire country's research output has been flipped, right, as a result of that. And that goes for the Netherlands, it goes for elsewhere. Is there still some way to go? Yes, there's definitely some way to go, because the US is still behind, but getting there rapidly now with the new OSTP mandate. China is the big beast in the room that has less motivation to change and, you know, and is a more difficult path, but it will happen. So again, a little bit like the research assessment reform, I'm feeling more positive now than I've felt in 15 years in terms of how quickly we can get there and whether it will be sustainable. It will be sustainable. We will get there.
Thank you very much. So, Dominic, back to you. Are you happy to pay what you're paying for? I think you kind of hinted to this already.
Pay for it myself. Yeah, I think open access is super important, and I'm pleased to hear that we don't have to pay more than we are paying already for open access, and it would be wonderful if we can keep it going within a reasonable cost, whatever the reasonable cost is. And one thing that I find quite difficult to understand is how the APC is calculated for a journal. I don't understand why there are differences. For example, we can address that later. That for me, if I want, what is the breakdown of that cost? How much of that is the actual dissemination? How to make it open access and accessible to readers all over, relative to, let's say, the editorial process and all the sort of people who are involved and need to do that work? Because I'm happy to cover the cost as long as I know what I'm paying for. And I have to say that for a long time in publishing, I have no idea what I'm paying for. I'm presented at the end of it, when I'm so exhausted by the end of the whole process of, going through the whole editorial process. And by the way, here's your bill, please cover that. And I'm like, fine, whatever. I just want it over and published and done with. But I don't understand where the costs are coming from.
Let me talk a bit about the journal ecosystem as a whole, because I think this does impact things, right? I talked about 3,000 journals that we publish. There's a lot of different types of journals in that, right? Now, there is a bunch of journals that are called, that are referred to as sound science journals, right? And so these are journals which I think can publish at a relatively low APC level and do, for hopefully still maintaining the quality that we want. And the reason they can do at a lower APC level is because what they're doing is essentially they're not looking at the importance or the impact of the research they're publishing. All they're looking at is, okay, look at the data and look at the conclusions. Do the data support the conclusions? Is the study sound, right? Does it have that integrity, right? And so there's no bar of novelty or impact or importance or whatever you want to call it for those journals, right? So for those journals, they can operate at a relatively low APC level. However, the vast majority of journals in the ecosystem are not like that, right? One of the biggest is, so the biggest open access journal in the world is Scientific Reports, which we publish. That's a sound science journal, right? So if you go submit to Scientific Reports, you know, and your data support the conclusions you made, and there's no, you tick all the technical boxes you need to tick, you should get published, right? That's the way it goes. All the other journals in the world have their own, let me be really frank about this, subjective bar. But they're saying how important, well, so firstly they're also saying, is this within scope of our journal? Is this the type of paper that our audience cares about, right? But they're also saying, is this important enough? Is this good enough for us And that is ultimately it's a subjective decision, you know. I'm sure, Angie, as an editor-in-chief, you're thinking about that when you look at making decisions on papers, right? And when you're talking about the very top end of the APCs, and you are talking about nature, right? And so this is the problem with this model at the nature journals, and this is why my idea I want to go have an open access option on nature. That's why it didn't fly, because at that point, nature journals reject more than 90% of papers that are submitted to them. So let me give you an answer about one of your nature papers. What are you paying for? You're paying for all the people we're rejecting. If you get accepted, you're paying for the nine sets of authors that got rejected that we still considered. We might have, half of them were peer reviewed. We took it through, and in the end we rejected them, so that we got nothing from them, And so that's the problem with this, with APCs, and so that's why that highest APC is for nature. So for the nature journals, we're considering, we're editorially assessing somewhere between 60 and 70,000 papers for those nature journals. We publish about 4,500. To handle those papers, we've got more than 300 dedicated people, and that's not including like all the sort of the central functions that support those journals, the technologists and so on. 300 full-time people, 200 of them are professional editors working on those nature journals. So so if you think about this as a faculty at University of Oxford, these people range from junior postdoc level up to a chair, right? A professorial level, right? So that's the big part of supporting those nature journals is those highly skilled. My colleagues. Well, I used to be one, so I guess I would say they're really great. I don't know, wouldn't I? But yeah, so that's a big part of that. And yeah, I mean, then you've got the other things. I mean, we do on our website. We have a value of publishing page that talks about the factors that go into an APC a bit more specifically. But it's about the value of what is delivered and also the cost of what's delivered in those things. But I think the big picture again is not all journals are the same. So you can get a very low APC as for scientific reports and others, and then Nature is the example of where an APC is very high because of all those rejections.
Just gonna add one thing there. So I will accept that explanation for the cost of Springer Nature, but I would just add to the idea of the cost of publishing, whether that's via APC or subscription. I mean, something that used to be brought up a lot was that Elsevier's profit margins in the early 2010s were higher than Apple or Google. They're approaching almost 40%, which is a bit unheard of for any industry. And it wasn't really clear where all that money was coming from, what it was all being spent on. Their sort of like editorial and promotion budget was huge. Now, we don't even know what the profit margins are now, because since Elsevier has merged with the publisher Thomson, it's all sort of meshed together. And we think Thomson has a much lower profit margin, but they report them together. But all that said, we're not really sure where the value is coming from the chain. We just have to take it as read from these explanations. One thing that is being pushed by the Plan S coalition, if you're aware of Plan S, this is the group of funders and governments, including the Wellcome Trust, that are pushing for all open access for all of their papers. They've gotten agreements to do so from many governments. So one thing that they are pushing but have not secured in all of their jurisdictions and all of their deals is a full itemized costing of where their money is going in publishing. And their argument is simply that, to a certain extent, the Wellcome's not, but the government of Germany, the government of the UK, is a government body. And if you are tendering for a contract with a government body, you better have a cost breakdown of where their money is going. So just to say, I will accept that explanation, but the process of where your money goes can be very opaque, as it is for many private businesses, and it is something that many people are asking for a change in.
Okay, can I just ask a question before we move on? So I think we're in agreement that it clearly costs to publish, whether some journals charge perhaps more than they need to. I work for Elsevier, so I'll declare my conflict of interest, but I can tell you they don't spend their money on their editors. But the question remains, it costs something. Who should pay?
Am I going to answer that?
Well, I'd love to know the panel's view.
Let's give me a break.
Well, I'm going to return to my comment before. Research communication is an integral and important part of research, right? So I think, let me give kudos here to Coalition S, because they, as one of their 4 principles, have said researchers should not pay for this, right? So the example you gave of where you run out of the grant and then some researchers actually pay out of their own pocket should not happen, right? And Coalition S are very clear about that. So they say funders and institutions should pay for it, and I think that's completely fair. You don't expect, researchers don't expect to buy their own test tubes or buy their own computers, right? And so it should be down to funders and institutions, it's a cost of doing research, to do research communication. So I think that's who I would say has to pay for it. But is that happening at the moment? I think we're not quite there yet. We did a white paper we did survey looking at where APCs are being paid for now, and we showed it's a very interesting and mixed picture. A lot of them are coming from research grants, but some of them are coming from institutions' budgets. Some of them are coming out of people's pockets, right? Or getting out of some, like you say, their next grant that maybe doesn't relate to this paper, but and it's a very complex picture. But ultimately, that's why I think the payment has to come from. And I just would comment on the point Stephen made before about profit margins and so on. If you think. So even at that top level of Elsevier, right? So that means that if Elsevier cut their margin to 0, you get a 40% discount on your APC, right? That'd be great, right? But is that going to be the difference between publishing with that journal or not publishing with that journal? I'm not so sure, right? I'm not so sure it matters. And when talking about the nitty-gritty of actually costs, do researchers themselves, do you want to know, oh, you spent this much on the marketing budget, you spent this much on the production, you spent this much on the communication, this much on the editors? Is that really going to help you make a decision? I would say what helps you make a decision as a researcher is, is this the audience for my paper? How quick is it going to turn around? All that sort of thing. Will getting a breakdown of that, will that help you really make the decision? Dominique is probably best place to say.
Well, I agree to some extent with what you said, but I also find it, so essentially we do all the work. The scientific community. The hard work. I appreciate all the editorial stuff, but the reviews are done by scientific community who are not remunerated for. We spend years doing the research. We do most of the editing, right?
Yeah.
So, I don't want to be unfair on the contribution that the publishers make, but we are, I think...
Central, yeah.
Well, central and probably the fact, so we essentially pay for the privilege of working to further ourselves.
But I agree, because this is something that comes up all the time. I agree, totally, right? So researchers write the papers, right? They're the producers of this research, and they peer review them as well, right? The researchers are a part of that. But that doesn't mean that doesn't cost managing that peer review process, taking the paper through the systems, publishing it. Does that mean it costs nothing? Does that mean it's worth nothing? We don't, like I said, if we took off the profit margin, that's still most of the costs of Elsevier. If that's not the margin we operate at, certainly. Our reports are public, you can look at them, we're in those sort of low 20s, right? And so that's still, does that mean that that's valueless, what we do? I don't think so.
No, that's not at all what I was suggesting.
Yeah.
But I actually think it's good for us to know where this money goes, right? I think we have the right to understand. And coming back to your original question, whether changing by 40% or even 30%, even 10%, if you publish 10 papers a year, it adds up. And you can send a student to training, and actually we all, I think, count our pennies at some point, because funding landscape is what it is at the moment. So I think if the APCs went down, we would all benefit from it. And in fact, publishers would probably benefit from it as well, because we would have more money and time to do research as well and publish more, ultimately.
Well, it's an interesting scenario, isn't it? Because when it was under a subscription model, it was the reader that was the consumer and was making a decision, and right now it's the author.
The other way,
And if you push this onto the institution, it's going to be interesting to see the dynamic that comes from that in terms of the pressures and back on the publisher. Stephen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit of historical context to that. I think you're just about right with the sort of loci of power there. So for much of the history of scientific publishing, the, I guess, sort of friction was between, if there was any, about the way the system worked, was between partially scientists and publishers, but mostly research librarians and publishers. And it was the librarians who were like, God, we're spending so much damn, because they're ultimately the consumer in the sense that they don't consume the paper, but they spend the money. So, we can define them as the consumer. I think what you're seeing now, from my perspective, is the sort of negotiation, librarians having failed to reform the system many times, have sort of, with Plan S, you're seeing them move up to the level of funders. So highly organized, concentrations of power. Governments, mass funders like the Wellcome Trust, billions of pounds under management. And so I think one of the reasons you're seeing things change and you're seeing a bit of friction is because you're just going to see a negotiation between that different center of power and the publishers. I don't think the publishers are going to go away. I'm sort of an idealist like most scientists are. I have ideas about how publishing should go, but I think that, we're going to be asked later about where we think it's going. Don't quite know, I'll have an answer for it later. But what you are seeing now, as you pointed out, is the future being negotiated not between librarians and publishers, not between scientists and publishers so much, but between publishers and funders. And so it's those interests now that are sort of hashing those things out. And it's easier to understand what's going on when you see it that way.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. And I would say it's the librarians have not been completely disintermediated out of this, right? So I think, and I would applaud the librarian community actually in the proactive approach they've taken to transitioning from subscription to open access. They've been supporters of open access, even though in some ways, from their perspective, they are taking away something that they've had control over big subscription budgets. Now they're saying they're transitioning to open access. In some ways, that's sort of moving their role in this away. So, let me give you the example of the project deal in Germany, because they were one of the biggest ones. So it's not just the funders; that's the funders and the institutions, right? And the actual and what they did in Germany, they all got together and they appointed the Max Planck Digital Library as their agent, essentially, their negotiating agent for the whole community in Germany. But the key point you made, which is absolutely accurate, is that these are now getting together in these centralised negotiations, right? And so that's good. In my view, it's good because, who needs the hassle as a researcher? Apart from the money, which is, again, is a pressure, who needs the admin of being, and no one needs this admin, right? We don't need admin and processing, individual payments from individual, much better to have systems in which it's all managed centrally. We've got expert people that are managing it. It's being monitored, being reported on. It's being it's all transparent in terms of how many papers you're paying for. It's all managed by people who that's what they care about, like the librarians, and maybe it will still be the librarians that are in control of these published budgets as well as the read budgets. That's a much better system to go to. Will there be pressure on profit margins? I think so. As a result of it, right? Because the more power in a negotiating system that you have, the more pressure you can put on that. So you know, I don't know.
That's business.
That's business, right? That's the way capitalism works. And so, and it'll be governments doing those negotiations, hard-nosed negotiations. And on our side, we've got our salespeople. I'm not on the commercial side, but you know, we'll be making our points, they'll be making their points, and you know, and if we can't compete because publishing is a competitive industry, you've got to compete for researchers to make yourself an attractive location for their papers, but you've also got to compete with deals that you're doing centrally now, right? So where they're saying, oh, well, I'm comparing you to Elsevier, and guess what? Elsevier is much cheaper in this area. You know, you've got to do better. You know, so I think that will be a natural process that will happen.
That's great, thank you. So what I would like to do now, Lulu, you have got a question at the end that you're prepared for, but I would like to just shake this up a little bit, perhaps by inviting questions from the audience. So if somebody, we may need to use one of these microphones, but does anyone have a question that they would like to ask the panelists we have? Excellent.
Hi, thank you. I'm a dermatologist. I'm from India. I'm actually editing one of the books by Springer Nature now. I have a question. Do you think if you are shifting olive as of now, if all of the economic or financial obligations shifted to the authors, you might increase the number of readers in Kenya, India, etc., but you would actually reduce the number of publications coming out of India, Kenya, etc. Because, for example, the amount of ABC, suppose it is £9,000 for one article in Nature. A lot of our project grants are not even half of that. And Kenya, India, neither of them are included in the list of exempted, and there are no exempted countries, sorry. There are countries that you offer 50% waiver to, and they are not included in that. So do you think it might, if you make it from 50% subscription to 100%, then all of it is open access, and all of that is borne by the authors, do you think that it might effectively, in some time, because these countries don't have very strong negotiators like Germany does, so would it in effect shift all of the readers to obviously all over the world, but the publications would then be coming out of these countries because the authors can't even afford to pay that much from their own pockets even if they tried. So yeah, that's for me actually. Thank you.
Take this first, Nick.
Yeah. You've identified one of the really key issues as we make this transition, and that's ensuring that doesn't become a new barrier for those publishing from the global south, lower income countries, lower middle income countries, that sort of thing. And I think there's still some issues that need to be resolved there. But I'd highlight that at least at the moment there are mechanisms that prevent that happening. So, for example, we've got for all of our fully OA journals, we've got a waiver policy such that all of the people, all lower income countries and all low GDP, lower middle income countries can get full or partial waivers of APCs, right? And then so that's one thing. So those are fully OA journals. And for the nature journals, which are of course this headline number for nature journals, we actually set up a special fund for all lower income countries and lower middle income countries, such that they will automatically be published for free in those journals, right? So this is the situation now. I think in the future they'll have to be, we'll have to come to other solutions that come to 100%. But one of the other issues that you spoke to is the field differential in grants, and we mentioned, I think we might have mentioned that before. STEM grants are much bigger, so APCs as a percentage of your grant is not that, not as big, right? But when you're talking about HSS fields, humanities, social sciences, the grants are much smaller, so APCs suddenly seem much bigger, right, as a percentage. And I think that is one of the proven things that transformative agreements, these agreements that where you're taking the money from subscriptions, you're transforming it into supporting both what's left of the subscriptions and the publishing. That has been where we've seen a real step change in terms of equity, because these transformative agreements, we've gone from humanities and social sciences, where these agreements are in place, where they're publishing in open access only, less than 10%, less than 5% most of the time, when one of these transformative agreements is in place, suddenly that has transformed that whole field, right? Because it's all been centrally paid. And so the equity issue for that field in that country at least is then solved by this transformative agreement. So I think there's a number of areas of equity we need to look at. And as I said before, we're going to get there. We will be publishing open access, and our aim, at least, is that no one should ever not be able to publish due to financial need. We need to look at all of the models to get us there, but we will get there. I've got no doubt we will get there.
So can I just build on that question actually, because it's very obvious to think about different countries in the world as being an issue. But if you just focus on the UK, there's also a disparity between different universities, different institutions, and each institution is separately negotiating these transformative agreements. So do you see that there's going to be a disparity, and it could actually create more inequality in a university structure through this model? Sorry, Nick, you seem to be...
That's okay. Well, I mean, I'm the publisher here, and it's about the cost of publishing, so fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think it's this central issue of we've got enough money, right, to pay for this, but it's not always in the right place, right? And how do you solve that, right? And so centralised transformative agreements do help this, right? Particularly like the Germany type model that I've mentioned a couple of times. JISC have negotiated on behalf of the whole UK sector, but just to explain to the audience who may be less au fait what the problem here is. It's essentially what you're trying to do. You're taking the money that is currently spent on subscriptions and turn it into supporting publishing, but there are winners and losers in this scenario, right? If you think about a smaller institution that is less research intensive, right, where they're not publishing a lot, but they are subscribing to a lot because they have to serve an undergraduate population and still apparently they're actually in a better situation because you're transforming a larger subscription budget into thing. Whereas a research intensive university like Oxford is in maybe a slightly more difficult situation because you're one of the biggest producers of research papers on the planet in terms of a university, right? But because of your size and negotiating power, maybe you've got a better deal on subscriptions previously, right? So that's a difficult. So I think it is difficult, and it is, but I think there are ways of doing it, and there are ways of getting there, which these centralised agreements are a way of doing it. Let me give you another example, because I've given the Germany example too many times. So this time I'll go to the US, right? One of the biggest transformative agreements in the US is with California Digital Library, which is essentially the UC system, the University of California, which negotiates as that whole system. And these are some really big universities, UCLA, UC Berkeley, and so on. They produce more papers out of that system than most countries, right, in the world. And the interesting model that they developed with us and others is this kind of multi-payer model whereby, so the US will never get together in a one big national deal. It's too fragmented, there's too many players. But what the UC system has done very cleverly is that they're covering a certain percentage from the library budget of the article charges, but then they're asking for a co-contribution from the grant fund. So it's a way of leveraging the funder funds without actually getting the funders to be a party to the agreement. And so that's made a huge difference to UC. They've gone from, they've got like 180% increase in the amount that their papers are being used and so on. So there are different models that are going to achieve it. So yes, you're right. There's still problems. There's still things that have to be got over. The devil's in the detail. But again, I'm very confident that there are the models out there that can be worked through and get to that point.
Thank you.
Quick addition to that. Just to return to the question of are there too many papers published? I'm generally not a huge fan of using sort of financial discipline as a way to do it, but I will say if you want Oxford to look at the question of are too many papers published, if you want the UK government to look at the question of are too many papers published, tell them that Oxford is publishing 50,000 papers a year or whatever, and they're on the hook for the cost of all the APCs. And I think you'll see a committee looking at whether you need that many papers. So one of the questions about this, who pays for it, is also just, do we need to be publishing quite as much as we currently are, or could we sort of bring that down?
Absolutely true. Yeah, I mean, I've just got to add to that, because I think it's a really good point, is that one of the benefits of the transition of this system is that you now are directly linking to the numbers of articles to that are paid for to the research output of the institution, right? So University of Oxford will now be paying according to the number of articles that they are publishing, right? So that direct linkage focuses the mind. And one of the reasons that librarians have been, in such a difficult position for so long is that they've had their budgets assigned to them, and they haven't been going up, but the numbers of papers that are coming out have been going up. So publishers are making a not completely unreasonable point that, well, we're giving you a lot more content now. We want you to pay us more money. And the librarians go, I haven't got any more money. My budget hasn't got up, right? And that's because from the institutional perspective, the institution there's not a direct link between the papers that they produce and the papers that they subscribe to. It's a very indirect link, in fact, because it supports. Your researchers have to have access to literature to do their next thing, but that's quite an indirect link. So you can cut that budget, and it's not immediately going to impact you in terms of your productivity as an institution. So this world in which we're headed towards, where the productivity of your institution is directly linked to the payments that your institution is making, I think is a more sustainable way of setting things up economically.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, I'm Maria Cárdenas from Peru, Universidad Peruana Cayetano Heredia. Thank you very much to the panelists. I want to share with you another barrier that researchers face. When you ask for a native speaker reviewing the manuscripts, sometimes all the research team are Peruvian, and it's almost impossible to find reliable people to review the writing. So if that is something that we could do or consider in any way, the publishers, of course, that would be fantastic, because this adds to the bill that we have to pay. Then the second point is just to share that sometimes we publish a main paper funded by an international body, a good journals, but then we have a lot of information that also needs to be published, that is more secondary information in this case, and we don't have funds for that. So sometimes this is used by master students, but then it can't be published because there are no possibility of funds. So I don't know if a specific scale for these cases. When you know that it's high quality because you already published this in a great journal, in a excellent journal, that would be fantastic. And the third point, I would like to know what's progress or process are you following to be more efficient? Because that would also help to reduce costs without affecting the quality. Thank you very much.
I think that's definitely for you, Nick.
Okay, so 3 points. Let me start with your first one, which was about language and getting and taking that away as a burden. Again, I'm repeating myself, but I'm very excited about this area now, because I think we are now, right now, like literally in the last 6 months, we are now I think it's entirely viable that we can have a system in future whereby people are submitting in any language to any journal, and then people are reading the papers in any language in any journal, right? Because AI is going to be hugely transformative. This is getting into the final topic, right? And so I can see, which I'm really very, very excited about, because that is one of the key equity issues we face at the moment. Is that people all over the world, English has become the lingua franca of science, right? And if it had been Spanish, or if it had been Mandarin Chinese, I never would have become a scientist because no way I would have been able to do it. But how many people in China, in Latin America, in other parts of the world, who could have been the next Einstein, the next, whatever your particular field is, that James Watson from my area. Maybe that's not a good example, actually. It's not in this era. Francis Crick, maybe. How many people in those parts of the world are we not seeing contributing to science just because they might not be, like me, good at languages, right? So I think I'm very excited about that as an area. So I think you will see that change in future. The last one was, I'm going to get to you, you might have to repeat the second one because I've forgotten, but the last one was about efficiency, right? I think, yes, there's going to be there is a huge amount of focus at us, at our company at least, at making things more efficient. And you've already heard Dominika speak about her painful process. And this is not an uncommon or unreasonable comment on her behalf. Indeed, we ourselves published a paper recently about how much of an issue it is for people having to format things for different journals and so on. It's just nuts that we're doing this. So, we're investing in terms of technology platforms to enable this, to make it easier. And so over the last 3 years, we've invested 350 million euros on our platforms, and it's to make that submission system thing easier so people don't, and AI is going to play a role in this too, so people don't have to enter in all these details. But you've got to remember that we're also asking more and more and more from this system, right? We're asking this system to be to help us enable open science better, to enable these are key checkpoints for research integrity. We're aiming to do a better job of it, and that means that continued development. So, I think it will become more efficient, but the history of technology revolutions does tend to show that, yes, they make things faster, they make things better, they make things more delightful, right, to us. Do they end up in taking costs down? Not always, right? Not always. So that's something. It's quite unpredictable. So theoretically, if we just had to do the same thing we're doing now and just get better and quicker at it, I think we could come down. But I don't necessarily think it's hard to predict whether. But there's going to be competition anyway. That's the other thing. Is like if you can't compete and someone else is doing it more efficiently, then you're going to be in a whole world of pain if you're as a journal or a bigger publishing company. You've got to compete, you've got to innovate, you've got to invest and you will increasingly have to compete on cost, right? Because we've got these central negotiations that are going to happen. We still got to delight researchers and make their life easier as we do it. So there's pressures on the system to push it in the right direction.
Well, if I may, I know you had another question. I thought we will come back to that. I think there's an informal bit after this. But in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move to the last part. So sorry, everybody that had their hand up. You will have a chance to ask informally. The panelists will be around at the end. But we are moving to the close. So I would like to finish by going to each of the panel members and you just commenting on your view, your vision, if you like, for the next 10, 20, 50 years of publishing. So perhaps, Dominique, if we could start with you.
Right, so, well, I think within the next 10 years, hopefully we can publish only open access, and I think that's achievable. Hopefully we can make the system a bit more efficient, and I agree with the previous comments that I have lots of hopes and how I would like the publishing landscape to change, but I think it has to come from an academic, from the scientific community, how we want our publishing landscape to look like, and then work with publishers together. And because there's so many things that are dependent on publishing, there's some simple solutions to make technical aspects much easier. I think it would be great if we had a uniform format for submission, for example, and that would already be a massive help. In terms of the financing, I think it's beyond me to answer that question. I would like the cost to be really reflective of what it actually costs to publish a good paper and distribute it. And I think we need to also look more, because obviously maintenance other databases costs money as well. So how is that all taken into account? And I think it's really beyond me to be able to really answer, but I think we need to simplify the system, make it as cheap as possible, and all work together to make it as good for everyone as possible. And I think that would be me.
Okay, so we can pass
Do you
down
want to
the
give
panel.
Nick last? Because I think you probably have an actual concrete. You guys have a vision for the future. Mine's very short. My job is not to predict the future. Yeah, I was just going to say I don't really know what the future brings because I guess my interest in this or my research in this was largely from a historical perspective. But I will say from the history of scientific publishing, you've got these very large concentrations of power and money, whether that's in funding, in science, in publishing itself, and you don't get very many chances to disturb or change such things. The only time you do tend to get to change anything in this world is when either something breaks down or new frontiers open up and everything sort of gets bigger, and fills that new space. And those are the sort of two times you see a lot of change. And I would just say that at this moment, I wouldn't say it's a breakdown, but the entry of large funders into the conversation, the continuing disruption of the internet. Technologies, of course, do not change things on their own terms, but they allow us to change things if we sort of use them correctly. Leads me to believe that we are at an inflection point. When I first started looking into this, I would have predicted that nothing would change very much in scientific publishing. I would have thought, given my reading of the history, that open access would take a very long time to catch on. It's been an idea for a very long time. The internet, in the form we need it to be to share scientific papers, has been sufficient since the 90s, and nothing had changed, so I thought nothing was going to happen. I've seen more change, in the past 5 years than in the preceding 20. So just to say, it is a moment of great change, and sort of if you are a scientist and you're interested in the way you do science, the way you communicate it, you might want to look into this stuff, either to follow it or to get involved in it. Scientific societies may have a line on what they think about planets, et cetera, et cetera. Your university may have a line on what it thinks about this kind of stuff. So it's relatively easy to get involved. But yeah, the final point is just, I have no prediction. My only prediction is we are at a moment of great change, and there is going to be sort of great change.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and you've already heard me talk on previous questions about that. I'm very positive about the way we're headed. I agree with Dominica. I think more likely than not, we'll be living in a world in 10 years' time, maybe a little bit more, but anyway, 10 years' time, where there are no research articles behind paywalls anymore, right? And I think that's something that's going to happen, right? The thing I would add to it, and in terms of disruption and inflection points and so on, is the AI point. I think this could change completely everything, right? I mean, honestly, the publishing industry I'm in could be completely disrupted by this. It could end up that publishers, as they currently their current role, are completely disintermediated by technology companies or some other player. While I'm positive that we're still going to be in a world in which research is valued, research communication is valued, and maybe it's a more equitable, fairer, diverse way of doing that, I think it's really unpredictable where we're, 10 years, I could just about, I think, I'm pretty confident there'll still be some sort of publishing around. 20, 30, I don't know, it could be a completely different system, could be new players, different players. We might not be talking about publishing in the same sense we do now. So I think the future is positive, but the future is unpredictable as well.
That's very helpful. Okay, so I'd like to finish there. So I'd like to say thank you to all of the panel members. I'm sure you have very dry throats now. So we'll move to the final section, which is just out the back. Or are you going to say something at the end?
Oh, no.
I'd like me to finish.